Why is the topic of trade, more relevant for Qatar today or the GCC today?
Especially on tariffs because of the new U.S. administration. Obviously, there's lots of changes happening and people that raise people's eyebrows, I think. Why is it relevant for Qatar? Because
Qatar as a country and therefore its supply chain needed to create World Cup in 22, which suddenly put a huge pressure on the country.
Importance of trade and the supply chains for a country like Qatar.
The unified customs tariff is typically around 5% across most of the goods. Companies in Qatar are procuring material, let's say, from Turkey, but Turkey might be buying from some other country, which you also need to take into consideration. So it's not just where you're buying from.
Hello, very good day to all of you. My name is Jitse. I'm with the Chartered Institute for Procurement and Supply, that's CIPS, here in Qatar. I'm one of the volunteers for the Qatar chapter. And today I'm very excited. We had the first ever podcast recording of the CIPS Qatar Supply Chain Podcast. It's been amazing. And we couldn't have done it without leaders. And today I'm together with one of the co-founders of Leaders.
I am Sheikh Farouk, Managing Director and co-founder of Leaders Training Center. We are proud to be an accredited training provider and an exam center of CIPS in Qatar, offering all the levels of CIPS program, all the way from level 2 to level 6. We're also very proud to have partnered with CIPS Qatar for this podcast series, and we hope that you'll enjoy this very first podcast. So whether you're just starting out in procurement or you're an industry experienced professional, I'm sure there'll be a lot of learning from this particular podcast. Thank you very much.
Welcome to the Qatar CIPS podcast. Thank you, Steve and Yalin, for joining us to talk about a very topical subject, which is trade tariffs and their impact on supply chains in Qatar and the GCC. I'd like to start out, if you can, with presenting yourself, introducing yourself to the audience. Steve, could you let us know about who you are and your role?
Yeah, sure. And thanks for the invitation. As you said, this is an intriguing topic. My name is Stephen Mackenzie. I've been in Qatar for just on 8 months now, having taken on a role in the country as supply chain director for Fardan. Prior to this, I've been working in the UAE for 4 years. Prior to that, in Australia, all in supply chain and procurement roles. Prior to Australia, New Zealand, UK, and the US, however, not in procurement, but on the operational side or the dark side of business. So fairly diverse career through many, many industries, including hospitality, hotels, real estate, property development, property management, oil and gas, agriculture, automotive. So a lot of diversity in my experiences and hopefully in the view that I have around this topic.
Well, I would say you've probably seen quite a lot, and it'll be very interesting to hear your perspectives as we get on this evening. Yalin, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do, your role?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you for your invitation, first of all. I'm in banking. I've been in Qatar for 11 years by now, and this is my 30th year in banking. So I'm originally from Turkey. I started out my career in Turkey in banking as well, in City, and then I moved on to London. I've been doing trade finance in the last 20 plus years. And in particular here, I'm the global head of trade finance and cash management sales for one of the largest banks here. And in that perspective, we constantly talk with our customers in relation to how they manage their supply chains, how do they tackle the issues that they face, regulatory issues or, pricing issues, managing their inventory in a timely way, etc. There are many different risks that they have to manage. So it's quite timely because there's a lot of talk recently about tariffs, especially. So very happy to be here and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you both. And to those listening in, Qatar CIPS is part of the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply, which is probably the world's oldest and largest professional body representing procurement and supply professionals all across the world. And we exist to help professionals, the organizations they work for, and the communities within which they exist to prosper and to do the very best from the perspective of professional, ethical, and sustainable supply chains. With that said, I would like to say a little bit here on trade, trade from your side. Why is trade, the topic of trade, more relevant for Qatar today, or the GCC today, than it was a couple of years ago? Any thoughts, any input on that, please?
Sure, let me take that. So in relation to trade and tariffs and why it's important for Qatar. So when you look into the factors that are impacting your strategy on how you manage your supply chain, I think tariffs are one of the main factors that impact your strategy. There are many other components, of course. Who are your production partners, sourcing partners in terms of your production costs locally, etc. So there are many factors impacting the whole thing. So recently there has been a lot of talk, especially on tariffs, because of the new U.S. administration. Obviously, there's lots of changes happening, and people that raise people's eyebrows, I think, and raise a lot of attention to the subject as well. Why is it relevant for Qatar? Because there are a number of dynamics in Qatar. First, Qatar is trying to diversify its economy and trying to move away, diversify from hydrocarbons. So that requires, of course, seamless access to different kinds of raw materials, services from different countries. So that's one dynamic that's important. Secondly, Qatar is also trying to build, its national security around food and other critical supply, let's say, materials for the community that's living over here. And of course, as Qatar is trying to diversify its economy, they need to import materials like machinery, construction material, consumer goods, etc. So all of this put together, of course, changing tariffs will be super critical for Qatar. One important and interesting fact about Qatar actually is, as I was thinking over the last couple of weeks, is Qatar has proven to be a super resilient country, obviously, having gone through the blockade several years ago. And I was part of that story. I was here at that time. So the country very successfully redesigned its entire supply chain. It's a monumental success story, actually, if you think about it. Not just, of course, at government level, every single company in Qatar had to redesign their supply chains. So that was, there were lots of learnings from that experience, I think. I think this is, if we think about all of the dynamics around Qatar, I find it very relevant to discuss the topic here.
Yeah, and I have to agree with you. Qatar is, using your word, an incredibly resilient country, particularly with respect to supply chain. You've mentioned blockade and the independence that Qatar as a country and therefore its supply chain needed to create. The other significant event was the World Cup in 22, which suddenly put a huge pressure on the country and its infrastructure to deliver a massive event, world-class event. The pressure on supply chain, on procurement organizations, procurement teams within the companies that benefited from such an event needed to lift. Everyone needed to learn more about volume, how to source that volume, how to rely on the global economy to support that event. So not only the blockade, but also the World Cup soccer event, has really combined to create the infrastructure, the supply chain infrastructure needed to address challenges that trade changes, trade implications globally present to the country.
Yeah, no, thanks for highlighting the importance of trade and the supply chains for a country like Qatar that is reliant or dependent on sources from outside, but also I think it's really good to hear that, and it's reassuring that even if there are disruptions in the supply chain, Qatar is a country that has actually proven that at short notice it has the ability and the will to reconfigure itself. Now, hopefully things don't go that far, but maybe that takes us to a next point, and I think many of our viewers and listeners would benefit and I think be interested in hearing, how do you as an expert define tariffs? And can you maybe explain what is the tariff structure that is applicable to Qatar, and how could that change based on the things we hear about and see in the news?
Across GCC, the unified customs tariff is typically around 5% across most of the goods. There are obviously some exceptions on certain foods, medicine, so maybe industrial machinery, etc. But tariffs is actually just one of the factors impacting how you manage your supply chain finance. There are non-tariff points as well, such as product certifications, health inspections, etc. These are all other factors as well that are impacting how you manage your supply chain. One also has to think about tariffs are not necessarily across just bilateral countries. If you think about it, Qatar companies in Qatar are procuring material, let's say from Turkey, but Turkey might be buying from some other country where there are tariff impacts on Turkey. So there will be a ripple effect, which you also need to take into consideration. So it's not just where you're buying from. I think as a company, as a supply chain finance manager, for example, I'm thinking the CFOs, supply chain finance managers will have to think about the entire chain of the supply and the impact of tariffs on every step of the way.
So what you are saying, Yalin, here, and I think this is a theme that I have seen as a supply chain manager over the last couple of years, is that visibility beyond your first tier becomes important if you want to understand what could potentially either come at you or what you need to do in order to avoid it coming at you. I think this is a very, very good point and very interesting point for the viewers and the listeners, which is that knowing your tier one supply is good and should always be the case, but you need to go beyond that.
Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah, and not just visibility, but it's the knowledge and expertise within your organization to be able to create the data, create the information that gives you that visibility. Certainly that's an opportunity that I've seen not only in our business, but generally across supply chain and procurement organizations in Qatar, is there is a very fundamental and sometimes misunderstood view of what tariffs are, a simple definition, and what they mean to an economy and why they are there. Tariffs are there for a number of different reasons. Sometimes it could be protectionist. There could be a developing industry within a country. So tariffs are applied to support that local industry. And certainly we find that particularly in the food and beverage space, there are some emerging and developed food production enterprises here in the country. And without the protection of tariffs, those enterprises wouldn't fail, but they wouldn't be as successful as they should be.
That's a very interesting point, I think, or set of points. You have talked about the role of data and, let's say, information technology in actually understanding and possibly responding to exogenous factors like tariffs. It would be good to know, Steve, what do you see either at the company where you're working right now or where you've been in the past, or even others that you've heard of, how are companies using data and digital technologies to help them be more responsive against the effects of, for example, tariffs?
Yeah, that's kind of an interesting story because it's almost horse before the cart. There are a lot of businesses who are making investments into technology. The unfortunate thing is that technology alone won't give you the insights and the visualization that you're looking for when there are challenges to supply chain issues. Sometimes we forget about the people in behind that. The tools are only as good as those people who are utilizing and using it. Inputs, for example, it's the same old thing, garbage in, garbage out. So whilst I see there is investment in technology and tools to help us understand the landscape, there is a lack in training and teaching people, how to use those tools and how to interpret data, and secondly, how to go out and research and collect data to put into the tools into the first place.
Some people would argue that AI will help to go out and collect the data, but also to provide analysis and recommendations based on root causes. Do you see organizations using AI to maybe address some of those gaps that you talked about there on people, on training, on quality? And if so, has any of you seen the other big topic, which we hear a lot about in the news, AI in relation to managing tariffs for supply chain resilience or competitiveness?
Yeah, again, sometimes AI is a misunderstood topic or description, and there, obviously various layers of AI within the supply chain experiences I've had. Yes, there's a natural tendency to try and be more productive in the way in which you do that, and there are some AI-based tools, and I think a ChatGPT is a really simple example that can help in sort of front-end process efficiency or automation of information. The reality is that AI will come into the fore when you start talking about big data. In Qatar, I don't think we are dealing with data at that level just yet. So to say that AI is going to help, yes, it'll help downstream. At the moment, I think sometimes it can just create confusion. If we talk about RPAs, robotic process automation, for example, that's probably more valuable to procurement practitioners, given that we are very transactional in the way in which we approach procurement, and in the way in which we approach supply chain. Those concepts are more valuable than a generic AI topic.
I would agree, and if I can add a few points to that, the way I see AI being applied in this topic in relation to supply chain finance and tariffs, the data points in relation to tariffs, in my view, is that tariffs are mostly decided upon based on political motivations and certain strategic initiatives in certain countries. For example, as you were saying, there are certain industries which we want to, focus on and prioritize. So therefore, you could just apply certain tariffs to promote the production in that particular sector, industry. So there's not much data analysis requirement for that. Where the banks use AI or companies use AI is, for example, in the banks, we use AI in terms of when we process huge volumes of transactions, reviewing documentation, for example, from our exporter customers. Instead of doing things manually, you can use AI-powered tools to speed up the processing of such information rather than analyzing the tariffs, for example. In my view, the way I look at tariffs is, it's mostly politically driven. Country by country, we see a lot of a protectionist, nationalist type of approach globally now. It's a trend, I think, the way I see it globally, not just in the US, in most of the countries globally. So that trend, I think, is here to stay, at least for the short term or medium term. In the long run, we can't tell. But using AI for tariffs, I would say AI is used more on processing data within the bank, within the companies, rather than how we analyze.
And listen, the amount of investment that has been channeled into technology and tools and into emerging technologies like AI, I would suggest that if we focus on a real gap, and that's a gap of expertise and understanding in the people within the business, focus some investment in there so there is a greater level of understanding around what tariffs are and the impact of tariffs on our businesses, then we're going to get far more value and far more ROI out of that investment than we would in a tool that looks at a whole bunch of data points. You need the people to be able to understand what those data points are, the reporting that has been generated as a result of these tools. If you don't have that, then all we have are pieces of paper that no one really knows. They don't have an understanding of, and importantly, they don't know how it's applied to your business to make change in your business to respond to the changes that are happening economically and globally.
I would like to change gears a little bit and maybe get to some very practical examples that our viewers and listeners can either relate to or even learn from. And Steve, I'll first start with you asking, what do you see are the responses within procurement, supply chain departments on tariffs? Have they actually started to affect you, and how do you see them being dealt with?
Yeah, so that second part of your question is really interesting, because there's a lot of talk and conversation about tariffs and the impacts that they are having, but I'd argue that there's little impact. The real challenge that we have is around the anxiety that this conversation is creating. And it's the anxiety rather than the tariff that is causing problems and the challenges within our business. Because we understand little, we're going, oh my gosh, how do I respond to tariffs, as opposed to how do I respond to this lack of knowledge that I have about what is happening in the world. Have a look at where, or the genesis of this tariff conversation. We have another country in the world who is saying, hey, listen, all the goods coming into my country, we're going to tax them. Okay, that's great. And it will have impact if you're buying goods from that country. But the great thing about Qatar is that we're diversified in terms of our supply chain. We don't rely on a particular country. We've got diversity in terms of suppliers, both locally and internationally. We've got diversity in terms of the countries that not only we source from, but our suppliers source from. So it's really interesting question. What are we doing about tariffs and what has been created? Not a lot. Where it's business as usual. What we're trying to do is understand what business as usual means to us. So in order to look at what that means, we look at the whole visibility issue and how we collect data and how we understand it, not only at data points, but it's around digitization of data, moving away from manual processes into things that are more automated and digitized. We're looking at developing our own in-house forecasting tools and also the reporting from a supply chain point of view, what that looks like, and also how we communicate that into the business. That's another thing, because we are so transactional in nature, we forget about the information that we can generate as a function, supply chain function, procurement function, whatever you want to call it. We forget that we have got access to so many data points that there is value in communicating that data and that information. However, we don't have the expertise to do it. So one of our focuses is developing that expertise in-house or by engaging consultants and we've got a great program in our business where we will sponsor interns who are currently studying specific disciplines like AI, like data analysis. We sponsor them. They come into our business. They learn about how they apply theory to a business situation. And this is one sort of avenue that our business participates in that I'm really keen to take advantage of, because we have that ability to connect what's happening theoretically with the real world.
I think what I like with what I heard from you, Steve, is, I mean, you said a number of very important points in that. The first one is one of the functions of a supply chain team or a procurement and contracting team is to be able to shift things around to where it makes sense to buy them so that your business can continue operating reliably, profitably, safely. So I think the tariffs is a new thing on the block, but in the past it may have been other things. I think that's very...
And you're right, the strategies haven't changed. I've talked about visibility. The other, and you've touched on it slightly, is that diversification of the supply chain, whether it's geographically based or what have you. One of the key strategies that we're employed at the moment is dual sourcing. Now, dual sourcing is saying that, hey, we've got a single item and we typically buy it from one supplier, but because of the volatility in the market and in the world, we need to look at that one item and have a backup plan, have contingencies. So now we are developing a framework where we say, even at a one item level, we'll have 1, 2, or 3 suppliers, particularly within that critical item space.
Indeed. And I think this is a very practical way for people to actually be even more responsive to potential disruptions in the supply chain, given that there is arguably more volatility now. And I'll come back to that in a moment, Yalin, to you. But I also want to just pick out 2 other things that you said, which I think is very important for people listening in or watching this. The first one is that in your experience, this is more about anxiety than actual impact, because whilst there is an indirect, let's say, trickle down from, let's say, buying from China or from the US or from other countries, Qatar has the ability to diversify its supply chain. So I think that's one very good thing to take away. The other thing that I just want to say here is many of our members are student members. And I think what you heard there is an invitation from Steve that if you are good is at least as students, connect with businesses and make sure that you can, in some way, shape or form, offer to help them and in the process get exposure to real world problems. And I think you just mentioned that this is actually something that is valued at different companies. So that's great.
And it's not only reaching out, because a lot of people will contact me saying, hey, listen, have you got a job? It's more than that. It's making connection through your learning institutions, through your universities, and looking for companies who support learning outside of the university campus. And as I said, Fardan does a great job in this space. And supports an internship program. And every year there are an application process that's required to run through this. So if there are any of our listeners or any of your listeners who want to look at these types of opportunities, then by all means, keep an eye out, make an application, and see where that takes you.
It's great. And I think another thing, because that is important, we need to, as Qatar CIPS branch, work on behalf of our members to help them understand which are the companies that are forward-looking, outwards-looking, engaging with the student body and learning institution, research institutions, because that's where you drive innovation. I want to come back to you, Yalin, for essentially the same topic on the implication of the tariffs, but maybe more from a macro lens, because arguably you see a number of different companies operating in this space. There is a view, if you watch the news, that there's an attempt to actually dismantle globalization. And there is a view that actually what Steve said, which is that suppliers have a global marketplace and can relatively easily access that, may not exist in the way that it has been, by the way, built up over the last couple of decades. What do you see? Do you see that procurement and supply chain people will be able to shop around and with relative ease, comparative to past, be able to continue? Or do you see that that could become harder?
I don't think it will become harder per se, because there's a lot of data, there's a lot of information. If you compare, for example, the amount of information available to any of us now versus 20 years ago, it's incredible, right? Thanks to internet and, all of the nice technologies that we have in our hands now, information is available at the tip of your hands. So therefore, I don't see that as being more difficult. But there's a lot, of course, that's happening. From a bank's perspective, particularly, what I see is obviously companies try to diversify their suppliers as much as possible, adapting to the trends, as you were also talking about. Like there's a trend to localize some of your suppliers, at least the critical ones, create alternative resources. What I also see, especially last few years, that there are companies, not necessarily fintechs, but smaller companies, and we partner with some of them as well to provide solutions to our customers. And these companies, for instance, step in between you as a company and your suppliers, and they take over the specific task of managing your suppliers, making the procurements on your behalf, and keeping that inventory on their own balance sheet, negotiating the pricing if necessary, getting better financing pricing from the banks. And that sort of lowers the impact on your own balance sheet as a company. So if you want a leaner balance sheet, for example, you don't want to keep huge inventory, there are companies who are specializing specifically on this area. So that's one of the trends, for instance, that I see. And I see global names in IT, healthcare, and different industries working with these types of companies. And we partner with these types of companies as well, because, you can't specialize in every single field, but this is something that I see that's happening in different parts of the world.
Yalin, I think that's a very interesting point, that the bank has partnerships with and facilitate some of your customers to reach out to companies that offer procurement capability on their behalf. How popular is this option?
Well, I can't say it's very popular, but it is becoming more and more popular. So you see, the way banks operate in the last couple of decades have changed dramatically. Banks are now competing with fintech companies. Banks are now competing with IT companies directly, like Google's of the world as well. And you see specialized small fintech or financial companies emerging, supporting different requirements. For instance, when you log into your bank application, I see it is becoming almost like an app store. You will have different functionalities available to you, different small apps options available to you in your main bank application. So the more partnerships banks have in different areas, the better services those banks will provide to their customers. And that's what any bank with global ambitions will need to do. So that's how it's working now. So therefore, in that aspect, Is this becoming more popular? Yes, absolutely. We see more companies focusing on supply chain finance, whether it is about providing the digital platform to see entire supply chain ecosystem in one digital platform. You can see all of your invoices flowing through globally, regardless of where you are located. Let's say shipment is done, invoice is issued, accepted by the buyer, etc. All of that stuff can be digitized, and these are not necessarily done by the banks themselves anymore. Banks, in fact, try to choose the right technology partner who has expertise in that specific area rather than developing it in-house as it used to be in the past. So
I think it's great to hear that banks and the financial sector is playing the role in the ecosystem to facilitate trade, to facilitate supply chain, and to facilitate competitiveness. And the reason why I am particularly interested in this is because as part of the Qatar CIPS branch, we hold a Chief Procurement Officer, Chief Supply Chain Officers Roundtable.
Right.
As a matter of fact, we have one later in the year where the Chief Executive of the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply will be facilitating that with private and public sector companies or organizations. And I think what's very important and good to hear is that Qatar's regional competitiveness, as per the National Development Strategy 3, or also known as NDS 3, actually accentuates logistics, supply chain, and trade as one of the pillars in which the company can diversify and add additional revenue on top of the oil and gas elements of the economy. So really great to hear. And I think what I would definitely suggest to viewers is that they work much more closely with their banks to understand, can this give them an edge in relation to their business?
I was just going to touch on an example that aligns with the national strategy and something that as a company we are involved in. What the government is doing there is creating a platform that connects businesses with suppliers. So they're looking at providing a technology-based platform, bringing in suppliers for companies like ours to post opportunities and make some connections at that level. So a real world example of how we as procurement practitioners can contribute to that sort of broader strategy.
I think it's really good to hear. It's great to hear that Fardan is indeed participating in government platforms or government, let's say, supported platforms. And I know that the government, as part of the National Development Strategy, actually not just has a vision, but also has a very clearly articulated plan that is being executed. And I just think it's great for our listeners and viewers to hear that there are real world examples of companies taking this up and benefiting.
That's right. You often think, as a procurement manager, as a procurement specialist, how can I make a difference? And how can I contribute to these sort of broader strategic themes? And the reality is that you need to be brave. You have ideas around how procurement can contribute functionally. Things like the whole visibility space and how we report on some of the information that we gather. Dual sourcing, I've mentioned previously, but also in terms of developing our own knowledge. What do we need to understand and learn in order to contribute? And as we learn more, we become more confident in challenging some of the norms within our business. So, there's an opportunity there. I also look at how we interact and communicate with our suppliers. Traditionally, it's very transactional. But one of the strategic themes that I'm talking to our business about is how we engage suppliers as a true partner, how we can take our SRM efforts to our supplier relationship efforts to another level. And that is, again, moving that relationship from a transactional one into a strategic one. We look at we talk about our suppliers as advisors. They know more about what is happening in global trade and global logistics than we do. So we need to tap into that knowledge, and we can all contribute to that. Every buyer has a connection with a supplier. In their communication, they can ask questions about the challenges that our suppliers are facing in terms of their supply chain, and more importantly, feed that back in through the partnerships that exist. The last point as well is, and you touched on it briefly, is the way in which the demand side of our business, the role in which that plays in terms of how we source. Many businesses on an operational side are still working in a transactional way. But there needs to be changes in that space if we are to be agile as companies in an ever-changing world of logistics, supply. It needs to be more dynamic. And we all have a role to play, regardless of what level you're at.
Can I just add one more point to that? I think it's very important that you mentioned about relationships with your own suppliers and down the chain, because from a banker's perspective, that is so important. When we try to set up programs for our customers, supply chain finance or distributor finance type of programs for our customers, the one thing that we look at is obviously the banks are there to take risk, right? Credit risk, payment risk, FX risk, commodity price risk, etc. And one of the ways the banks obviously mitigate this risk is we look into the depth of the relationship between the buyer and the seller and the track record. So that's absolutely critical in the whole scheme of things. So tariffs obviously is just one component of the risks that the companies, procurement managers, supply chain managers have to manage. And I see banks actually as one of the key partners of that supply chain ecosystem, right? So banks are merely, let's say, like middlemen putting together the pieces and providing the right platform for supply chain finance managers to manage their supply chain business at the end of the day with the right technology partners, etc. But that relationship part is absolutely critical.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Yes.
Great. I think it's really some very, very good insights, both at the level of people practicing supply chain at different, let's say, levels of the organization. But I also think from an organizational perspective, the insight we got from Yalin there around what makes it easier for a bank to take a risk on a specific transaction or a project is indeed the relationship. And I would like to say, Stephen, that it's great to hear that organizations are now really truly understanding that their competitive advantage depends on their ability to innovate together with their suppliers. Because traditionally in some industries, in some places, there's been more, as you say, an adversarial relationship, and customers or buyers have been kind of dictating things. Now, yes, you can do that because of a relationship in the, in the power distribution of the relationship. But the reality is, if you want to get the best out of it, you need to approach it in a different way. So great to hear. So I'd like to ask you, as a last thing, both of you, what is the one thing every supply chain leader in Qatar should be doing today regarding tariffs? What should they take away from today's conversation?
Right. I think first and foremost, identify your top suppliers. Let's say look into your 80-20 rule and which suppliers deliver 80% of your raw materials, and run a stress test on them. What if I lose one of these suppliers? Do I have alternatives on any one of them? That's one thing to do. Stress test also your working capital cycle. What if you don't lose the supplier, but there's an extra tariff on that particular supplier, or they change the payment terms, that you're buying from them? So run a stress test on your entire working capital cycle. And of course, look into your banking partners. Who are you partnering with as your bank? Do they have the right platform? Do they have the right global know-how, digital platform, infrastructure in terms of operations, processing capability, and all of that. So those are, in my view, the three critical things that I would look at.
Thanks, Yalin. Stephen?
Yeah, I concur. There are two key points out of many. One is develop your internal expertise, develop the knowledge and understanding that you need to work within a volatile economy. And we do, both locally and globally. Invest in the people who are making decisions around what to buy, how to buy it, and where to buy it from. Unless they are prepared, unless they have the knowledge, then that decision-making is going to be flawed and it's going to create risk within your business. Secondly, work closer and in a different way with your suppliers. Move from transactional relationships to strategic relationships. As you said, identify that 20-80 Pareto rule. Look at who your key suppliers are and go beyond a price conversation. Go into tariff conversations with your suppliers. Go into the macroeconomics of what is happening in their space and also understand it.
If I can add one more point, not necessarily, for every company to do, but especially industry leaders in Qatar, for example, it is so important for them and leading banks to get together and work closely with government, because government plays such a critical role in managing these, impact of tariffs. For example, building this, the free zones, Qatar Financial Center, and these types of initiatives are absolutely critical to develop the necessary know-how in the country, develop the infrastructure, to help companies facilitate these types of solutions for the companies here in Qatar. So having that sort of network connection in the country is, I think, very important.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Yalin, for sitting down with us at this Qatar CIPS roundtable to talk about tariffs and how that affects companies and organizations in Qatar. It has been very, very informative and it has been very interesting. To our viewers and listeners, thank you very much for staying with us. We'll be back with more topics that are intended to help you be better at your job and understand how to deal with all the things that are relevant when you're a supply chain, procurement, and contracting professional. Thank you very much.
And if you have a topic, or if you think I know something that I really want to share, or if you're scared of what's happening in the larger supply chain ecosystem in Qatar and beyond, come to us and we happily have it as a next topic. Thank you and up to much more.
Thank you.